Well, look who finally figured it out. Look who's standing in the quiet aftermath of their own assumptions, blinking in the harsh light of realization. Look who just connected the dots a little too late. It's almost poetic, isn't it? The way clarity arrives, not with fireworks, not with confrontation, but with a subtle shift in the air, a glance held a second too long, a silence that suddenly feels heavier than before. They see you now, not the version they invented, not the convenient character they wrote for you in their minds, not the soft-spoken extra they cast in a story where they were always the lead. Number, they see you as you are, and the recognition unsettles them, because they got it wrong. They thought your silence meant you didn't understand. They thought your patience meant you didn't notice. They thought your kindness meant you couldn't calculate. They watched you absorb tension without exploding, endure slights without retaliation, step back instead of stepping forward, and they mistook that restraint for weakness. That was their first mistake. You weren't quiet because you were confused. You were quiet because you were observing. You were collecting patterns the way others collect opinions. Every offhand comment, every boundary crossed, every subtle attempt to test how far they could go. You saw it, you logged it, you learned from it, and while they were busy measuring you with a ruler that could only detect noise, you were building depth. They played checkers, quick moves, surface strategy, immediate gratification. They moved pieces loudly, proudly, certain of their advantage. Meanwhile, you were playing a game they couldn't even see. You weren't focused on winning moments. You were focused on understanding the board. You let them talk. You let them underestimate. You let them feel powerful in their small victories, because you knew something they didn't. Time exposes everything. They told themselves a story about you, that you were harmless, that you were too forgiving, that you would always tolerate just a little more. They labeled you predictable, manageable, safe to dismiss, safe to disrespect, safe to take for granted. And in doing so, they built their comfort on a lie. Because you were never safe to underestimate. You were simply controlled in ways they couldn't comprehend. You understood that reaction is a currency. That outrage is a performance. That anger, when displayed too early, reveals your position. So you stayed composed. You allowed them to believe you were unaware. You allowed them to feel taller in your shadow. But shadows only exist where there is light. While they celebrated their control, you were evolving. Quietly, methodically, pain didn't make you louder. It made you sharper. Disappointment didn't make you bitter. It made you discerning. Every time they thought you'd break, you recalibrated. You stopped explaining yourself to people committed to misunderstanding you. You stopped defending yourself in conversations designed to exhaust you. You stopped seeking validation from those who only offered it conditionally. And the shift was subtle. You didn't announce it. You didn't threaten. You didn't even confront. You just changed. Your responses grew shorter, your availability thinner, your emotional reactions less accessible. You stopped playing roles in scenes that drained you. You stopped auditioning for acceptance in rooms that never respected you. And at first they didn't notice. Why would they? They were too busy assuming permanence. They believed you would always be there, that no matter how casually they treated your presence, you would remain. But then something happened. They felt it. The warmth they were used to wasn't there anymore. The eagerness to engage had cooled. The soft patience that once absorbed their inconsistencies had hardened into something unshakable. You weren't angry. You weren't loud. You weren't even distant in a dramatic way. You were detached. And detachment is terrifying to those who rely on emotional access. They expected a reaction when they pushed. They expected a confrontation when they crossed lines. They expected drama, tears, raised voices, something they could label and dismiss. Instead, they got composure. Instead, they got a version of you that no longer needed their understanding. And that's when the realization started creeping in. You weren't the fragile one in this dynamic. You were the stable one. You weren't clinging. You weren't scrambling. You weren't trying to repair what they were comfortable damaging. You were simply stepping back and stepping up. They replay conversations in their minds now. Moments where you stayed calm when they were careless. Moments where you let things go instead of escalating. Moments they interpreted as surrender. Now they see it differently. You weren't surrendering. You were deciding what deserved your energy, deciding who earned your access, deciding what kind of life you were no longer willing to tolerate. You didn't snap. You didn't explode. You didn't deliver a dramatic exit speech. You just outgrew them. And growth is the most disorienting form of power. Because it doesn't attack. It transcends. They're uncomfortable now, not because you did anything to them, but because you stopped allowing things from them. They feel the shift in hierarchy, not one of dominance, but of relevance. They used to feel essential in your world. Now they feel optional. And nothing bruises ego quite like irrelevance. They try to decode you. They look for signs, for cracks, for proof that this new version of you is temporary, that you'll soften, that you'll slip back into the old rhythm. But you don't. You're not colder, you're clearer. You're not cruel, you're precise. You still smile, you still carry kindness. But it's measured now, intentional, no longer offered blindly. The masks are falling on their side. Not because you ripped them off, but because your composure reflects them too clearly. They see their own arrogance in contrast to your growth. They see their own insecurity where you stand steady. You're recognizing that what they thought was control was simply your tolerance. And tolerance has an expiration date. You stopped negotiating your worth. You stopped shrinking to maintain peace. You stopped playing supporting roles in narratives that minimized you. The script flipped quietly. They were convinced you needed them. Convinced that your loyalty was permanent. Convinced that your patience meant dependence. But patience was never dependence. It was discipline, and discipline evolves. Now, when they look at you, they don't see weakness. They see someone who endured without collapsing. Someone who learned without announcing it. Someone who doesn't need to prove strength, because strength radiates naturally. It unsettles them. Because growth without noise is difficult to track. They can't point to the exact moment you became untouchable. They can't identify when their leverage disappeared. They just know it did. And now they're left with something heavier than confrontation. Regret. Not loud regret, not dramatic apologies. But the quiet kind. The kind that creeps in at night. The kind that whispers, "I misjudged them." The kind that replays missed opportunities to show respect. They see you moving forward, calm, focused at peace, and they realize you didn't need revenge. You needed distance. You didn't need to win. You needed clarity, and clarity is more devastating than retaliation ever could be. Because revenge invites conflict. Growth invites silence. They're not afraid of your anger. They're unsettled by your indifference. They expected you to chase closure, to demand acknowledgement, to crave validation, but you don't. You found validation internally. You built closure without their participation. You decided your peace was not negotiable, and that decision changed everything. Now, they're standing in the space you once filled emotionally, and it's colder than they expected. They're realizing that access to you was a privilege, not a guarantee. They're recognizing that your restraint was generosity, not incapacity. They finally figured it out, not because you told them, but because you stopped. Stopped explaining, stopped reacting, stopped accommodating. And in that absence, your value became visible. You didn't need revenge. Growth was enough. You didn't need to fight. Detachment was the real shift. They're facing the consequences of their own choices, not because you orchestrated it, but because you stepped aside and let reality do what it always does, balance itself. And you moved forward without looking back, calmly powerful, quietly evolved, emotionally untouchable. Not because you built walls, but because you built standards. Peace, in the end, is far more intimidating than anger. And that's what they finally understand, too late. And here's the part they didn't prepare for. The part no one ever prepares for when they assume someone will stay small. You didn't circle back. You didn't flinch. You didn't turn around to check if they were watching. You just kept walking. And that quiet continuation is what unsettles them most. Because in their version of events, there was supposed to be a confrontation, a final argument, a dramatic collapse, a messy unraveling that proved you were just as emotional, just as reactive, just as tangled as they were. But instead, there was composure. Instead, there was silence. Instead, there was growth. They underestimated the power of someone who processes pain internally. They assumed that because you didn't explode outwardly, you must have imploded inwardly. They assumed your restraint was suppression. They assumed your calm was denial. They didn't realize it was integration. You felt everything. You saw everything. You understood more than they ever gave you credit for. But instead of turning your hurt into chaos, you turned it into clarity. You learned who they were without arguing about it. You accepted what they showed you without begging for a different version. You stopped fighting for potential and started respecting patterns. And that's when the balance shifted. Because once you stop arguing with reality, reality stops arguing with you. They still trying to rewrite the story, still trying to position themselves as misunderstood, as misrepresented, as somehow equally wounded in a situation they engineered. They tell themselves you're distant because you're bitter, that you've changed because you're cold, that your silence is immaturity rather than evolution. But deep down, even they don't believe it, because they've seen the evidence. They've seen how you carry yourself now, the steadiness in your voice, the way you no longer over-explain, the way your boundaries don't come with guilt attached. They've noticed that you don't react the way you used to, and that's what scares them. Not because you're threatening, but because you're no longer reachable through the old doors. You used to be accessible through emotion, through empathy, through patience. They could rely on your understanding to cushion their behavior. They could test limits knowing you'd soften the impact. Now, there's a structure to you, a clarity, a line. And once someone realizes they no longer have automatic access to you, something inside them shifts. They start to panic in subtle ways. They check for signs that you still care the same way. They watch for reactions. They provoke slightly, hoping for a flicker of the old version. But all they get is composure, measured responses, or nothing at all. And nothing at all is the loudest answer you could give. Because silence, when intentional, is not emptiness. It's completion. They thought you would crumble under pressure, that enough tension would force you to chase, to argue, to prove yourself. But pressure revealed something else. It revealed discipline. You didn't respond impulsively, you responded strategically. And when you realized the game was rigged for your exhaustion, You simply stopped playing. You stopped attending battles that offered no victory. You stopped investing in dynamics that drained more than they returned. You stopped trying to be understood by people who benefited from misunderstanding you. And that decision rewrote everything. Now they're left staring at the version of you they never anticipated. You're not louder. You're not more aggressive. You're not performing strength for an audience. You're just solid, grounded in a way that doesn't wobble when they test it. Confident in a way that doesn't need applause. Peaceful in a way that doesn't depend on their approval. And that kind of peace exposes insecurity in others. Because when someone stands calmly in their own worth, it forces everyone around them to confront their own instability. They feel smaller around you now, not because you diminished them, but because you stopped shrinking. There's a difference. You stopped adjusting your standards to maintain comfort. You stopped lowering your voice to protect egos. You stopped carrying emotional weight that wasn't yours to begin with. And in doing so, you grew into yourself. They processing it slowly. The fact that you're not coming back to the old dynamic, the fact that you don't need closure from them, the fact that their presence in your life is no longer central. It's peripheral, optional, and for someone who once felt like they had control, irrelevance is unbearable. They scroll through memories now, replay old conversations, notice the signs they ignored, the moments where you were clearly evolving, clearly withdrawing, clearly detaching. They realize you gave them chances. You gave them space to grow alongside you. You gave them opportunities to adjust, to listen, to show up differently. And they didn't. Because they didn't think they had to. They thought you would always accommodate, always forgive, always stay. They miscalculated, not because you became ruthless, but because you became self-respecting. And self-respect changes everything. You don't argue as much anymore. You don't overextend. You don't tolerate subtle disrespect just to keep peace. You've learned that peace built on self-betrayal isn't peace at all. It's exhaustion. And you're no longer exhausted. That's what they're reacting to. Your energy isn't frantic. It's steady. Your presence isn't seeking. It's centered. They expected anger. Anger would have been easier for them to handle. Anger would have kept you emotionally tied. Anger would have given them something to respond to. But indifference, composed detachment, that leaves them alone with their own reflection. And reflection is uncomfortable for people who built confidence on comparison. You're no longer competing, no longer trying to prove, no longer trying to be chosen. You chose yourself. And once someone chooses themselves fully, the need to be chosen by others dissolves. That's the turning point they finally understand. You weren't waiting for their recognition. You were building your own. You weren't hoping they'd validate your worth. You were refining it internally. You weren't dependent. You were patient. And patience, when paired with awareness, becomes power. They see the difference now. They feel it in the way you enter rooms without scanning for approval, in the way you speak without rehearsing for acceptance, in the way you leave conversations that don't align without apologizing for it. You're not aggressive. You're aligned, and alignment is immovable. They're left with their own consequences, not because you punished them, but because you withdrew your participation. And participation was the currency they relied on. Without your energy feeding the dynamic, it collapses under its own imbalance. They wanted you reactive. You became reflective. They wanted you insecure. You became self-aware. They wanted you dependent. You became autonomous. And autonomy is untouchable. You didn't need revenge. Growth was enough. You didn't need confrontation. Clarity was enough. You didn't need to win. You needed to evolve. And you did calmly, quietly, completely. Now they finally understand who they were dealing with. Not a victim, not a pushover, not a placeholder, but someone who absorbs lessons and transforms. Someone who doesn't break under pressure. Someone who outgrows environments instead of trying to dominate them. And the most powerful part, you don't even need them to admit it. You don't need their apology. You don't need their recognition. You don't need their regret. Because you already moved on, peacefully, confidently, without looking back. And that's what makes you unbreakable. Not anger, not intimidation, not revenge, just evolution. And evolution doesn't announce itself. It simply leaves others behind.